When you think about it, time is the only thing we really have. Let's talk about it. Everything you do comes down to time. Your job, whether you're hourly or salary, is time, right? They pay you for X number of hours of your time. If you're salaried, okay, you got to take your yearly salary, divide it by working hours. That's your hourly rate, right? How much, if you're hourly, you're probably actually working all those hours. If you're salaried, there's probably a lot more free time in those 40 hours a week than you might expect. That depends on, obviously that's going to depend on your exact situation, but when it comes down to it, they're paying you for your time, really. Pretty much every job is like that. There's more scalable jobs where it's not quite the same, but ultimately that's what it comes down to. If you're really good at your job, maybe you do the work really quickly. And if you're salaried, that works out to your benefit. If you make $100K a year, just for a nice round number, and you only really work 2 hours a week, well, you're in a way better position than if you work 80 hours a week for that same salary, right? The hourly rate is way better if you can do the job very quickly versus if you have to put in 80 hours worth of work. It's good to know how much time you spend on work, but it's also good to know what your hourly rate is, because then it lets you look at stuff like lawn care, getting your house cleaned, your apartment cleaned, having your car washed or doing any of these things yourself or any of the other things, right? If you make $40 an hour and somebody will cut it at $20 an hour, well, maybe that's worth it to you. But if they cut it at $40 an hour, so then if you do 1 hour of work for somebody to cut your yard for 1 hour, maybe that's not a good trade-off. And, same goes for anything else, right? If you want to get food delivery, well, if it costs $20 delivery on top of the cost of food, for most people, that's actually not worth it, at least based on median household income for the US. Some of those things, right? Like if you absolutely hate cutting your yard, well, then maybe it's more valuable to have somebody else do it. But this is also true for stuff like your commute, right? If you have to drive an hour each way to work, maybe it's worth taking a pay cut to only drive 5 minutes each way to work, because that gives you back an hour and 50 minutes of your time if your commute is then all of a sudden 5 minutes. Or if you're working from home versus working in the office, maybe it's worth taking a pay cut to avoid that commute, primarily in terms of your time, but there's other factors that go into it, right? How much wear and tear on your car, how much gas, or if you have an electric car, how much the electrical costs you, wear and tear on your car. So that factors in, and then the stress of driving to and from work every day, right? Because most of the time you're not going to be driving when there's no traffic. There's probably going to be some traffic, especially if you live in a metro area. You're not going to be able to avoid it. And even if it's not particularly hard, it's more like it's adding a low level of stress to your daily life and just raising it, even if it's just a little bit. It's an extra thing that's kind of weighing on you. And the same goes for, maybe it's worth taking a sizable pay cut to work somewhere where you don't hate your coworkers or your boss or the people who report to you or the corporate structure, any of those things. Maybe it's worth taking a pay cut, but it depends on how much those things weigh on you versus the pay, right? Because there is, for a lot of people, it's, hey, you can make $200K a year, but you're going to hate all your coworkers. Most people would at least stick it out for a year or two, possibly 3 or 4 or 5, or if you talk to some older people, 20, 30 years even, for much less money. But you have to look at those things. You have to make that choice, right? You have to decide if that trade-off is worth it to you. But to be able to make that decision, you have to be in a position where you can afford to take that pay cut, where you could afford to take a job that pays less for a smaller commute. And some of that's calculating out your current cost of going to work. If you want to take that pay cut to have a better quality of life, you have to be able to, right? If you're tapped out every month, living paycheck to paycheck, you may not be able to make that choice. That choice may be taken from you because you financially cannot make that choice. That's part of the trap of debt, right? If you're forced to live paycheck to paycheck, you're going to have different options than somebody who isn't. The constant forced payments are, in many ways, chains people will willingly take on for luxury items, right? In some ways, it's the golden handcuffs, especially if you're, it becomes more and more real. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, it's the luxury car, the extra 2,000 square feet on your house. So instead of getting a small, say, 1,600 square foot house or apartment, you went for the bigger place, and then now you have to make the payment. The constant eating out or drinks out, this all adds up and takes away your freedom. Now, it's a choice you can make, right? If those things are well within your budget, then that's perfectly fine if that's what you want to do. But if they're not in your budget, if they're tapping you out every month, then maybe you need to take a hard look at that and consider where you're at. You have to be honest with yourself on, are these luxuries something that you can actually afford? Are you in a position to afford them? Will you be in a position to afford them 5 years from now? And so it's better to wait versus buying them right now and having them and then having no money left over at the end of the month. Most of these luxuries are, for me, something that's not really in the budget. Partly because it doesn't align with my goals. And also partly because they're just not something I can afford. And so I'd rather let those things go than trap myself in debt. And sometimes it's not your spending either, right? If you have a spouse, it might be your spouse's spending that's trapping you in debt. And that's something both of you have to be on the same page for. It's not really the topic of this, but it is something to also factor in. If you have a spouse, how their spending affects your financial future, your financial freedom. The little luxuries are stuff that add up real quick, because it's never just one thing, right? It's not a coffee every day. It's always a coffee and something else and something else and something else, right? It's the coffee and the luxury car and the dinner out and, oh, let's get a drink at dinner. Oh, let's have dessert. Oh, let's take this vacation. Let's pay for Netflix, Max, Peacock, any of the other services all together, right? Now, most of those things are fine, right? If you're like, I can't live without Spotify Premium, then have Spotify Premium. But if it's Spotify Premium, it's all the Netflix, it's the coffees every day, right? All those add up, right? If you're spending $7 a day on coffee, right? You get a coffee every day. I'm assuming most people don't drink it black based on Starbucks. I think the average Starbucks order is about $7. A quick look says the average cost of a Starbucks drink is around $3 to $5. I don't think that's quite right, because I normally get a venti black coffee, and that's about $4. And when you start adding all these extra things to the drinks, they do add up, but maybe it's closer to $5. But there's stuff in there that can get to $7, and a lot of people really like those specialty sweet drinks, and those are going to cost a little bit more. If you're spending $7 a day, let's say you buy a sweet while you're there too, or a little snack as well. So when you get that up to the $7, that's $2,555 a year. Right? I'd be happy with an extra $2,500 at the end of the year. But it's not normally just the Starbucks, right? If it's just the Starbucks, you could go, okay, well, I'm going to spend that. I'm going to plan for that. That's included. But it's the, when you add in, okay, let's say you also take lunch out. Well, let's be optimistic and say that's an extra $10, even though it's these days, as far as I can tell, it's closer to 15, but let's say it's 10, right? So that's $17 a day, right? You can see how it starts to add up. The closer you get to $10,000 a year is 27 something a day. And you can kind of see how, okay, well, if we start off just flat, we're going to spend $7 on coffee and a snack, of course. You can see how you can kind of get closer and closer to that. And then all of a sudden you've lost an extra 10 grand at the end of the year. And if that's what you want to do, then by all means do it, but make it a conscious choice instead of something you just do without thinking. There's a lot more luxuries today than there were 50 years ago, even 20 years ago, maybe closer to 25 before smartphones. And smartphones are expensive. If you buy a new smartphone every year, that adds up too. But, it depends on what you want. If you want all those things, then that's your choice. But if you want to have some extra money, you want to save some, so you aren't trapped in your job, you aren't forced to work for the rest of your life, well, you have to make those sacrifices, probably make some investments. It's not something I can advise on, but there's stuff you can do to get to those goals, but you need to know what your goals are. If you can put off upgrading your phone, if you can put off replacing a car every 3 years, instead maybe you go every 5, or you just use it until it breaks, Well, that can save a lot of money, right? The average car payment, I think, is like $700 at this point in 2025. It's $700 a month. And you can get those down, but then you're looking at longer and longer term loans and paying more and more in interest, even though the payment every month is lower. That just adds up. It's just taking away from your financial future. Don't sacrifice your future for today. It's far better to sacrifice today for your future than the reverse. And, again, if it's within your budget, if you aren't living paycheck to paycheck and you want to buy those things, then by all means do. Or if you're sitting on millions of dollars, then do what you want. I mean, like, you're probably okay. But if you're, struggling every month, well, look at what you're doing and make those conscious choices. Say, do I really need this? Can I live without it? Try living without it. Go, okay, I can't stand it. I have to have Spotify Premium. I have to have my coffee every day, and the stuff at the office is too awful. Fair enough. But make those as conscious choices as opposed to just doing them because they're there. That's really what it comes down to, is conscious choice versus unconscious choice. If you're using credit cards or the buy now, pay later, which seems like it's just another form of credit card, essentially, that they're going to charge you interest on that. And if you can get away from those interest payments, you can really save a lot of money every year just by avoiding that. Right? It's an unnecessary expense for everyone, right? I would never advise somebody to put something on credit card and then make interest payments, right? Maybe you have to put something on a credit card, but at least try not to have to pay interest. And if you do, get rid of it as quickly as possible because it adds up so quickly. But in the end, it's your life. You have to decide where you want to spend your money, what you want to buy, what you don't want to buy, whether you want to live with debt or live without it. It's just something to think about. That's all I've got for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next week with another video.